Hey YouTube, this is Corlash1990, and for those of you who are still subscribed, may have noticed my name on here has changed and all the videos I had are deleted. I took a break from this, and I'm now recently coming back and decided to just focus on only dead card games and mainly do deck tech videos for them. I'll still do openings when I can, but I want more information like this out there for people trying to get into these games because I had a really hard time finding stuff like this for me personally. So I figured if I put this content out there, it'll help other people, like me that was looking for entryways into these games, and it'll just make it a little bit easier to understand and probably like what to purchase and how to go about building decks and whatnot. So yeah, I'm gonna kick it off with a WARS TCG deck profile, and this is for the Quay faction. And this deck primarily will focus on units over ships. And for those of you who know the Star Wars CCG, this game is very, very similar to that. In fact, I'm not going to go into the whole thing about that, but it's made by the same company. The company made this when they lost the license to Star Wars. And both games are great. I own both games, and I think this game's great. It's super cheap. I bought a bunch of boxes over Black Friday for like 10 bucks a box, like a whole booster box. So I bought an entire case. Then I bought some starter decks, and yeah, I built some decks off of that. So to start things off, I'm going to go over the locations. And so our first location is Occupied Tunnels. And this is the one we will start the game and play with. Basically, it just adds you 2 energy, adds your opponent's 1, has your icon. And vehicles don't add power to the player's total power during a battle here, which is okay. It's not really the greatest, but it's a good starting location. Again, we're using units instead of ships, so we want a location compared to a sector. Next is Captured Refinery. This one's really good. Again, 1/1 energy is not that great, but we have our icon. But the reason why this card is so good is its ability. It's you can do it once. You can pay 3 energy. Your opponent loses 1 energy for each of your inverted units here, and our whole deck is basically units that invert. So you want to invert as many as you can and then move them all to here, and then every turn you want to be activating this to drain your opponent for 5, 6, 7 a turn. Next we run Subterranean Passage. This one's again okay, it's just 1/1. You get your icon. Each time a player's Quay character moves here, that player may pay 8 energy. If a player does, he or she destroys target character here, which is pretty good. I mean, it's a lot, but if they're trying to contest this, you have a good way of just, getting rid of it. Next, we run 4 of the Hunter's Camp, and we can run as many as we want of this. Generally, in Wars TCG, you can only run 4 copies of a card, and this one says unlimited, so we can run an unlimited amount. 1/1. It's got our icon. You can play it as a location, as a site, or you can play it as an encampment, which basically you can put it underneath a location and you'll get the energy bonus and the icon bonus added to this without giving your opponent the extra energy. So typically, you want to just be running all of them, going wide, and then dumping as many units as we can on them to try and get as much drain on our opponent as possible. And finally, to round out the location cards, is a Derelict Freighter. And instead of running a 5th one of these, I decided to add one of these because we do have some ships in here just to have some sort of presence in space. And if we can play one of our own to try and occupy it, we can. The option's there. If you want to drop this for another one of these, you can. It won't hurt the deck in any way, shape, or form. That is it for the locations. Next, we'll go over the ships, which we only run 3 different kinds. So this one is the Karaktika, and it costs 5. I think I'm saying the name right. It has a threshold of 2, so we have to have 2 of those icons in play. It has a destiny value of 4. It has 5 power, 3 tactics, and 7 defense, which is amazing stats. Those are pretty good. I mean, by itself, not so great, but when you have it paired with something else, it gets a lot better. Characters aboard this ship don't count against its capacity, which you don't really care about that a whole lot. But its ability is you can use it once, lose an energy. Your opponent dismisses a ship here, and you can only use this ability during the move phase when you have no more than 1 card in your use pile. Typically, it's kind of hard to do that ability, but we have some cards in here that help mitigate that. And being able to dismiss an opponent's ship is pretty good, especially when we're trying to eliminate a space sector for our opponent. Next, we run 4 of the Taka Assault Craft. Cost 4, 2 threshold, destiny value 2, 4 power, 2 tactics, 5 defense. Pretty solid stats. And this ship is awesome. The reason why I run it is when it enters play at a sector where you have no support icons, which typically it will, you may search your use pile for any card and put it in your hand. If you do, shuffle your use pile. So it's a ship that tutors. And you notice a theme with our ships is I don't play any of the cheap ones with low power, because if I'm not going to have that big of a presence in space, I want my ships to really count when I play them. So 4 power is pretty decent. And last, we run 4 of the Taka Life Ship, which is 4 cost, 2 threshold, 2 destiny. Again, with the 4 power, has 3 tactics, and then 7 defense, which is pretty solid stats. And its characters aboard this ship don't count against the capacity. Again, they all have that. We don't really care about that. And if this did have a unit aboard, you could put it on top of its owner's use pile to give this thing an additional +1 power, which could come into play. But typically, we're just saving up enough energy to drop 2 or 3 of these in one site, initiate a battle, and try and clear out some of the presence there. And that is it for the ships. Next, we are going to go into the main part of the deck, which is all of the units. So first, I run 1 copy of Lyric. He costs 2, has a threshold of 2, destiny of 2, and his power is 2, tactics 1, defense 2. And it says each time an opponent's unit is lost at this location, you may invert this character, which is pretty easy to do. And he goes into a 4 power, 1 tactics, 4 defense, and then you can revert this character, and your opponent loses 1 energy. And so revert is you flip it back over. Then he's able to keep shifting back and forth, back and forth. Pretty good, and he's a unique character, so you can only have 1 copy of him in play, which is why we only run 1 copy. Next, I have 4 Flame Cutter, cost 3. He has a 3 threshold, which is pretty bad. 3 destinies, okay. A straight stat line of 2. And it says each time you win a battle here and have no more than 1 card in your use pile, which we have ways to fix that, you can invert this character. And when he's inverted, he has a straight 4 stat line, which is amazing. And then he becomes immune to attrition, which is also really good. So he becomes a very, very hardy beat stick that is really difficult for your opponent to deal with. So the 3 threshold is kind of worth it, in my opinion, and I definitely max out on that guy. Next, we run 4 copies of Hull Ripper. This guy's pretty good. Cost 2, 1 threshold, 2 destiny, a 3/1/3. And you can reveal a location from your hand and put it on top of your use pile to invert this character. When he's inverted, he becomes a 4/1/2. And then you can revert him to draw a card from your use pile, which is... it's not bad. I mean, I personally, once I invert him, I keep him there just for the 4 power. Again, we're just trying to dump as many cheap dudes as we can in play, invert them into better stats, and then just control the board from there. Plus, he has great artwork too. I like his artwork as well. Next, I run 4 Lewis Mahler. Cost 2, 1 threshold, 2 destiny, 2/2 for stat line. You can pay 5 energy to invert this character, which is really costly. And when he's inverted, he loses a power, and he goes to 1/2/5. And when you invert this character during a battle here, you may damage target unit here. So if there's like a character that really is like bothering you in a fight, you have the option to pay 5 energy to invert this dude to damage it and try to get rid of it, and hopefully your opponent doesn't have an answer to it. But again, it's another cheap character. 2 tactics is really good, just straight off the bat. You're trying to get into that 4+ tactic threshold to get those destiny flips. Next, I play 4 Frenzied Lewis. Lewis. I don't know how to pronounce that name. 1 cost, 1 threshold, 3 destiny. He has 0 power, 1 tactics, 5 defense, which is pretty good. And it has pay 3 energy and put 2 of your other characters here on top of their owner's use pile in any order to invert this unit. We're not going to be paying that cost most of the time. There's other ways to invert this guy. But he turns into a 7 power, 1 tactics dude with 0 defense. So he becomes just a really big beat stick. This guy, I think, is pretty key in this deck. And there's a card in here that lets you invert him cheaper, because losing 2 units is kind of a big deal. So just think of him as like a 1 cost or maybe a 2 cost 7 power dude, and I'll explain why later. Next, we run 4 copies of Toward Catal or Cattle. Catal. I don't know. Weird names. 1 cost, 1 threshold, 3 destiny, a 1/1/3 stat line, and pay 2 energy to invert this unit. And he turns into a 3/1/1. And he has a 1-time ability or 1-time per turn. Pay 2 energy. You cause attrition +1 here until end of turn, which is pretty good. Like, this guy is also really key for the Inverter deck. Just a cheap 1-drop that has its own built-in way to invert. And again, you're trying to invert as many things as you can to dump on that Refinery as possible. Next, we run 4 copies of Lewis Spearhead. He has 0 cost, 1 threshold, 2 destiny. So he's a good free drop, 1 power, 1 tactics. So if you're this like 1 tactics short to get a destiny flip, play this guy there and then initiate the battle and you should be good to go. And he has a way to invert, and it's pay 2 energy, invert this character. You may use this ability only when this character is at the same location as target character who has quick draw, which can come into play. I mean, nothing in this deck I think has quick draw, but it's a pretty common ability for other factions to be playing. So that could come into play. But again, we have other ways to invert this as well. And when he inverts, he becomes a 3/3/3 stat line, which is solid. And he has quick draw 1, which doesn't really matter. We don't play any weapons in here. Finally, to round out the units, we have 4 Ravagers. It is not an inverter unit, and it's the only unit we play that's not inverting. But it's a 2 cost, 2 threshold, 2 destiny for a straight 3 stat line, which is great. And the ability doesn't matter because we don't play any stockpile assets, but this card could be blank and I would still run it. This 3 tactics for a 2 cost, even if it's 2 threshold, it's too good to not run. And that is all of the units. So the deck is mostly just units because we're trying to flood the board with as many units as possible and just completely control all the sites in the game. And that's typically how we want to win, is through that and then the slowly draining your opponent out. So for the interrupts and everything else, we run 4 attack plan. This is probably one of the best cards in the deck. Cost 1, 6 destiny, which is great. 2 threshold, which is whatever. But it allows you to invert your inverter, and you can only play this interrupt during your control phase. So being able to invert any of your dudes just for 1 is really, really good. I'm not really going into too much detail about that. Next, we run 4 the Beckoning. Cost 0, 1 threshold, 4 destiny. Pretty solid. You get to search your use pile for inverter, put it in your hand, and then shuffle your use pile. Also another staple for the inverter deck. Next, we run 4 copies of Rousing Leap. I would cut 2 of these for 2 more copies in the next card, but I don't own 2 more copies of those, so I have 4 of these for now. It's a 0 cost, it's 3 threshold, which is kind of a bit much, but 6 destiny, which is great. It's an interrupt that's lost. I should mention this is lost and this order is used. So this will go back in the deck. That'll be gone forever. This will be gone forever. And typically you only ever want to play 1 of these a game to help with your use pile, diminishing your use pile to make your unit's abilities trigger if you need to. But it's as an additional cost to play this interrupt, you have to lose 5 cards in your hand, which is really costly. But you get to put all of the cards in your use pile into your hand. So on a turn, we were playing a bunch of stuff and there's like 10, 12 cards in your use pile. You can basically trade this plus 5 more cards for all 12 of those. That'll also eliminate your use pile. So when you go to trigger an attack, you'll have that 1 card in your use pile and it'll trigger all of those other characters that have those abilities that trigger off of no more than 1 card in the use pile, which is why we have 4 of them for now. And last, we have 2 copies of Revenge. 2 cost, 3 threshold, 4 destiny. It's a lost interrupt. It simply says your opponent loses 2 energy from his or her reserve. So typically in games, people want to lose energy from their hand because they can control what they're losing versus losing energy off their reserve deck or the draw deck, right? And potentially losing something that's really key for their deck in order for it to work. So this kind of forces that. I would run 4 copies of this if I had 4 copies. It comes in a starter deck. I think it might come in the first set. I'm not totally sure. I've only bought in boxes from the second set. But either way, I would run 4 of those once I have 4. And maybe I'll do an updated deck profile on this in the future once I have all the cards that I'm missing. Yeah, anyway, that is basically the deck profile. This deck is great, and it gives a lot of decks a run for their money that don't run anything in sites. And if they're primarily sector-based, like you're gonna control the ground game for sure. And against other decks that have a lot of site presence, this deck has a lot of power to it, and it doesn't really need weapons like other decks do. You just want to invert all your dudes, stack them all up on this, and then the game will probably be over in a couple of turns just going off of that. But anyway, if you have any comments or anything I should add to this deck or thoughts, let me know in the comments down below. Thank you all for watching, and I hope, again, that this helps some people trying to get into this game, trying to give them a little pathway into finding what they want. And I'll be posting deck lists for the next 4 factions within the next couple of weeks or so. I might try and pump these out a little faster. But anyway, thank you again for watching, and I'll catch you later.